Good evening. Welcome to Brownfield Ag News webinar series on COVID-19's impact on the agriculture sector. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter and livestock market reporter Megan Grebner. With us this evening is Scott Brown with University of Missouri, Daryl Peel with Oklahoma State University, and Corbett Wall. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started this evening. We have the chat disabled, so you won't be able to chat. If you have questions, we are glad to have them and we're glad to answer them. Please submit them using the Q&A button. We'll start this evening with opening comments from each one of our guests, and then we'll dig right in to all of the questions that we have that have been submitted ahead of time, as well as the ones that are coming in live. Scott, we will start with you.
Thanks again, Megan, and to Brownfield for hosting these. It's good to get kind of the current information out. I guess, you know, as I start tonight, I look at 91,000 head of cattle slaughtered today as maybe some good news and better news than we would have thought, just given how low some slaughter numbers were just a few days ago. So it's nice to begin to start to see some recovery. I hope that continues. I think that certainly has been the bottleneck. You know, that 91,000 head estimated for today, that we have to go back to April 14th to find a day where we had larger daily slaughter than what we saw today. So maybe we'll continue to crawl out of what's been a slowdown in terms of slaughter numbers. I again keep looking with some restaurants beginning to open, some food service pull that might help us all the way through as we continue on. We certainly have seen box beef prices move much higher as we've been short on product. We'll see again that pull between food service and grocery store as we move forward.
All right, Scott. Corbett, you're up next.
Okay, thanks, Megan. You know, we talked about what all went on the last webinar that we did leading up to COVID, but as we got into the deep, dark depths of the COVID-19 virus and what it had, the effects that it had on the cattle market, we saw unbelievable gouging from your packers, and it was unbelievable and right in everybody's face. And we had box beef cutout values get all in excess of 475, and they were running at about 207 before we got into the COVID-19, and we did not see any increase at all in your price of your finished cattle. So all that money was to keep. And if you go back and you figure a price equivalent for cattle compared to what box beef cutout values are, this past week your finished cattle should and could have been bringing $3 a pound on the hoof live price. And they were bringing top end 115. So that just the frustration that came out with your cattle people. And I'm not going to say that your market has really been that bad. In fact, before the COVID started, we were at 113 on fats, and now we're basically at 115, and probably better than we would have been if there had never been such a thing as COVID-19. Albeit your packers wouldn't have been making millions of dollars per facility per day. But it's just been gangbusters for your packers. And so, you know, we can't be frustrated with what our cattle market has been per se. It's just been the unfortunate problem that the consumers are having to pay that. And it's just now starting to hit home. The sticker shock is just now getting to your retail outlets. And if you guys have been out, I've seen a lot of guys sharing it around. We've got ground beef selling at $10 a pound. Most of it all from $9 to $10 a pound now. It's unbelievable. A roast, just a rump roast that you might feed your family on this Sunday afternoon can now, just an average size one can bring over $125 just for the meat. It's unbelievable. And we've also seen your Wendy's restaurants. We thought initially they were having trouble getting their fresh, never frozen ground beef that they tout. But now we see it's evident that they were able to get it. They just resisted to the price levels that they were being charged. And now we're seeing the same thing with other fast food restaurants. Sonic is no longer selling a double or multiple meat hamburgers anymore, only single meat burgers, because if they started putting more than one hamburger patty on each sandwich, then they're having to sell those below cost, and they're not going to do that. And it's once these bigger steakhouses and fine restaurants come out, they're going to have to reprint the menus. They're going to have to charge at least twice for their steaks as what they do. And then now we're going to have backlash from your consumers. It's going to cause our beef demand to go down. And it's all just been from the greed of the packers doing this. And it's very, very frustrating for your cattle people. And we are really going to see a backlash come out here, especially as we start to get our slaughter levels back semi-normal, and we're starting to get over this thing a little bit. And at the same time, your restaurants are starting to open, and we're starting to see more food service demand. So it's going to be very interesting over the next 6 weeks to see what's going to happen.
Thanks, Corbett. Daryl, you're up next.
You bet. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. Again, and I would like to share a screen if I can, Megan, and just show a couple of things right quick to go along with this. So let me see if I can get the right screen up here. Are you seeing that?
We are.
Okay. So I started with this. I don't remember exactly when we did the last one of these, but about that time, we and Oklahoma State actually was the lead on a study that was put together to estimate the damages at that point in time, about a month ago, just a little bit more than a month ago, that was input into USDA for the program that they're going to roll out, I guess tomorrow actually, in terms of the payments to the ag industries. And so that study showed, just based primarily on revenue losses, we estimated that the beef industry, all sectors had incurred about $13.6 billion. That was broken down across cow-calf, stocker, and feedlot sectors at that point in time. And at about the time that study was published, we could see that we were going to have some issues in the packing plants as the COVID-19 started to impact the workforces in those. And so we knew there was more to come. We said it in the report, and certainly that's been the case. We've seen a lot of things since then that have just really been a whole new ball game. So if you go back and look at this, that report was published at about right here. We were finishing up the first quarter slaughter, well above year-ago levels. We knew we had a lot of animals to process here in the first part of the year. It was going to get a little tighter through the year, but we still had some to go. And you start to see those impacts that really started the first full week of April. We began to see slaughter go down. Plants were closed for a time. Some of them we rolled in and out. Most of them, if not closed, were at significantly reduced capacity for some period of time. And so slaughter dropped 4 weeks in a row, getting progressively worse each week compared to the previous year. And Scott kind of mentioned this, we bottomed really the week ending May 2nd. We reached a low point there. These plants were closed. They weren't turning out any product, or in all cases, significantly less product. And then last week, we saw the estimated slaughter begin to recover a little bit. That's this little tick up here. And I put on here, based on what we've had so far this week, Scott alluded to this, Dr. Brown, that based on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday's estimated slaughter for this week, it looks like we're on track to see this week's slaughter come in here somewhere around 485,000 heads. So it does look like we're beginning to see a little bit of recovery. It's going to take some time yet to get back up. And obviously we have created a tremendous backlog of fed cattle in the meantime. So we're going to spend a lot of weeks ahead here trying to work our way through that backlog. As cattle back up, not surprisingly, we're starting to see carcass weights go higher counter-seasonally. And that'll be something that we have to watch going forward. Hopefully we can get to a point where we can at least sort of tread water on this backlog until we can make some progress and keep this from becoming a more serious issue. But not surprisingly, we are seeing some tick up in these carcass weights. Beef production correspondingly dropped dramatically over this 5-week period or so. So there's been a lot less beef in the market. Prices clearly have gone up, and I'll show you the box beef chart here in just a minute. On the meat that packers are selling, they're selling at least some of it at significantly higher prices. They're not selling near as much as they were. So a per head comparison is a little bit unfair there because they're not selling that much meat in many cases. Plants that are closed for 2 weeks really don't make a lot of money. And so that's been an issue that everybody's kind of had to deal with through this process. The shortage of meat in the market has made the spot market for box beef jump to phenomenally high levels. You have to understand again that product moves through the market. A lot of that product is pre-priced and so on. So not all of it is selling at this price, but certainly at the spot market with the shortages that we've had, retailers are scrambling to find additional product and paying some tremendously high prices for limited supplies that are available in the market. We're probably, it's been noted that we're beginning to bring food service back online. In many cases, they're just now opening a bit or maybe getting ready to, but they undoubtedly, if they're making those plans, then they've been ordering product for some period of time. And so both food service and retailers typically, work several weeks in advance in terms of supplies. And so that's part of what's going on in this market. I think that's all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing. I just wanted to show those pretty dramatic pictures that we've got right now in terms of what's happened the last month compared to, the April and May story has been very different than the March story was. And hopefully now we're kind of turning the corner and we're going to start being able to move forward a little bit. So, yeah.
I want to start, and again, this is a discussion. It's an opportunity for us to be informative, and I'm sure we're going to have some disagreements, and we're all not going to see everything on the same plane. So I want to start with, and we'll just get it out of the way. Senator Grassley, along with a couple of with some support, bipartisan support, introduced a bill that would. The 5014, we talked about 3014 when we did this the last time, and Corbett, you kind of took the lead on that. I'm going to let you start. Can you kind of take us through what this bill looks like and why this is something that the cattle industry and members of the cattle industry are pushing and supporting at this point? Corbett, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we have the first technical issue out of the way. So
I had some really good stuff right on the open. I forgot about it now.
We'll give you another chance.
Many of us felt like we needed to mandate a minimum negotiated cash trade for quite some time. I've talked about it. I worked for Market News in the Amarillo, Texas office. That's what we did, was collect feedlot sales in the mid to late 90s. Every single week, we'd get 100,000 head negotiated cash sales. You're lucky if you get 12 or 15, maybe 20 on the outside nowadays in the Texas areas. But we've just consistently dropped and dropped and dropped. And now, as a 5-area feeding region, we're around 22% negotiated cash, with the lion's share being formulas that are directly or loosely tied to that base price with some premiums and discounts there. But it's limited our market position and our ability to ever gain any ground in the market. And what it's done is it's suppressed prices, which are cattle feeders that are at least majority and almost always hedged up, and so they're not so concerned with the price levels. They're more worried about the basis every week or every time they have a show list ready. So it's suppressed your prices, and it's getting to the point now where your guys that raise yearlings and your guys that raise calves, your cow-calf producers, can no longer afford to do it. They have to have real money, and they need a market position. They need a price, which they're unable to maintain. And so, many of us began pushing for this mandated minimum negotiated cash trade. And it's hard to get together because the guys in the northern feedlot areas feel so much different than the guys in the southern feedlot areas. You've got Iowa that are sitting right now as an area at just over 50% negotiated cash trade. Well, they're not too excited about mandating 30%, even if it is per plant, and they would likely see a big boom in their negotiated cash trade. And Nebraska is sitting at about 33%. They can't get really excited about 30 either. And so they were wanting more, but we were all pushing in the same direction, which I think has been lacking the last several years from your associations and your people that are fighting for cattlemen's issues. But we were all pushing in the same direction. The problem is in your southern plains, and I can't talk about Colorado as much because of confidentiality reasons. We don't get a lot of information out of there. But, we had Kansas sitting at less than 20% negotiated cash trade, and Texas sitting around 7%. So that is ridiculous when you've got 93% of the cattle in the Texas Panhandle selling off of what 7% bring, basically, because most of those formulas are off last week's market, whether it be the high for the week or the weighted average or what have you, is the starting point. So we felt like we needed to get more competition back in there. And the guys in the Southern Plains were looking at 30 like it was a skyscraper they could never climb. But you're like I said, your guys in the Northern Plains felt like 30 was nothing, and they wanted to get at least 50. Well, your guys in the Northern Plains are the ones that decided to do the heavy lifting with getting in contact with the folks that can make a difference, i.e. Chuck Grassley. And so they pushed for this. There was no resistance from U.S. Cattlemen's Association or any of the folks that I was dealing with on pushing this on my platform. But your Southern Plains guys decided not to do anything about it. They kind of like the status quo. Most of them are made up of big corporate feeders. Like I said, they buy hedged cattle. They feed them, they charge the cattle yardage and feed, they hedge the cattle, they jump at the basis, they make money, they keep rolling. They don't worry about the little guys that they're feeding on as they're doing that. So we've just got to the point where we feel like we have to do something. Status quo is no longer working, and we're going to lose a large percentage of our small family farms and ranches if we don't get them some type of a market position somehow. And we feel like we want to do it through competition rather than bailouts like they do in the row crop sector.
So my question is, do we get concerned with adding government intervention or having to have more regulation or mandates coming in through legislation like this?
As far as I'm concerned, if you're in this country and you're doing business, the packers are not going to, or the government is not going to break up the packer monopoly. They're not going to do it like Teddy Roosevelt did in 1903 or 1905 or whenever he did it, when he saw that it was unhealthy for 6 packers to control 50% of the business. Now we're looking at excess of 85% from 4 packers. That's not going to get broken up. Anybody that's ever held their hand out for a drought check, for this stimulus deal that they've got going, for an LDP or what have you, is taking advantage of government intervention. And we've got to have it for a level playing field. It's no longer fair playing ground. So we've got to have it. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about having to have the government come in there. Cargill and Tyson and these big corporate packing operations, they're larger than the USDA. And I think people don't understand that. They're so large. we've got to have some control over them. And if we're not going to try to bust them up due to monopolies, we've got to have some kind of intervention if we expect the general public to supply them with product.
Daryl or Scott?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. There's a lot of issues here, lots of concerns, some very legitimate concerns. I've said before, and it's no secret that this is a very, very complex industry. It has lots of moving parts, lots of levels, and like it or not, a lot of things work pretty well. There are always things that we don't like as much as things that we would like to see work a little bit better, and that's all well and good. We try to address those issues. My biggest concern always in general is that we really understand the implications of these kinds of things when we start trying to change things that have evolved over time. And so, again, the reason that marketing arrangements have evolved as they have over time is that they do save a lot of money. People that buy hundreds of pens of cattle every week, the transactions cost of negotiating every one of those individually are very large. And if you restrict them to 14 days or less, then you basically expose everybody to a tremendous amount of risk. Nobody can plan ahead and avoid some of the production risks and business risks that go along with that. And so, if we decide we want to change that, so be it. But I think there's an implication here that there will be consequences. We may have better price discovery if we do this, but we very well may have lower prices once those extra costs get bid back into the market, and they will. Most of this stuff evolved really, as Corbett said, in the mid to late 1990s. There was a lot of interest in the cattle industry in value-based marketing and trying to improve signals in the cattle industry to get away from treating cattle like a commodity, recognize the differences in quality in cattle, pay signals appropriately to encourage producers to sort of do the right things to improve quality. And that really is what led us to the kinds of arrangements that we're using today, which have resulted, for example, in a significant increase in quality grading in cattle. We've changed genetics. We've responded to those signals, and now we're grading 70-75% choice versus 50% back in the mid 1990s. And so those kinds of changes over time were the result of improved market signals and quality distinctions in the market. So, whatever we decide to do here as an industry, I think it's very important that we really think through all of the consequences and be sure that, we understand all of the trade-offs. There will be trade-offs, and ultimately, we choose what we choose. That's fine, but we need to really be sure that we understand the consequences of those choices.
So let me ask this, and Scott, I'll go to you first. Hypothetically speaking, let's say we have that 50% in place. Looking at the situation that we're looking at now and what we've been seeing, would prices have been higher with that 50%, the mandate that 50% of trade is cash right now, hypothetically?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Megan, and I think there's no simple answer, and I'm sure all of us are going to have slightly different opinions about this. I always start, and I'll agree with Daryl about better price discovery. So I'm more than happy to see the discussion begin to unfold to make sure we get better price discovery. Better price discovery should not be equated to higher prices. And in fact, whatever we do, we want to be careful about that being connected to just how COVID-19 has played out. I think it's difficult in all of these industries, given the bottlenecks that we faced at different points in time, to have a perfect system that would operate in these extreme times. So I think this is a good discussion to have longer term. It's good for the industry to go back through this. To your question, I'm not certain that we wouldn't have had lower fed cattle prices than maybe we've seen over the last few weeks with more cash negotiated trade. And that to me has a lot more to do with, we had a lot of plants that were shut down. We have a lot of extra cattle. I don't know that the packers that were processing had to bid very hard to make runs. So I'm not so sure that additional negotiated cash trade would have gotten us necessarily higher prices over the last few weeks.
Daryl?
No, I agree with that. And, you know, again, the question of price discovery is a very legitimate question. Obviously, you know, if you base a lot of the industry off of a smaller percentage of negotiated trades, there is the potential to reach a point where the thing sort of implodes. And that's a question, again, that has been researched for a long time in many industries by agricultural economists, this question that we talk about as thin markets. And the question always is, how thin is too thin? And there has been a lot of work done in the fed cattle industry. And it shows that there are very distinct differences in different regions of the US. There is no research that would support the idea that a single mandate across the entire industry would be beneficial. The level of cash trade needed for viable markets is different in different regions. You know, the northern half of this country and the southern half of this country from a cattle industry perspective are two very different industries. And that really shows up in this discussion and in the way that things have evolved over time. So again, you know, when you start getting the government involved in telling people in the industry how they can do business, you start restricting. That's a slippery slope, I think. We think we're doing it at one level right now, but I'm not sure where that stops. That's a precedent that you really want to think pretty carefully about before you go down that road.
Corbett, I'll let you take this, the last swing at this before we move on to a new topic.
Okay, you know, this mandated minimum cash requirement, that it's not just a COVID-19 thing. You know, it's something that we've been wanting for a long time as we watch this industry continue to vertically integrate, just like the hogs and the chickens did. But as we watch that, and some of us are not too excited about the reality of that, but it's not a COVID-19 thing. Now, would fat cattle prices have been higher the last few weeks had we had a minimum negotiated cash trade? It's all about the negotiating skills of your cash sellers. Back in the, like we talked before, the 2000s and the 90s, back when we had a healthy negotiated cash trade, guys took it as a challenge, you know, to try to squeeze all they could out of their show lists every week. Anymore, guys pay more attention to the board than they do their cattle or their negotiation. They jump at the basis every time they get an opportunity because they're all hedged up. But if you had some guys that were using their head and negotiating, it wouldn't matter that your packers were harvesting half what they were before. The 50-14 would be 50% of their weekly volume. So those packers would still have to go out and search for cash cattle. They would have to fill your Midwestern auction markets and still have fed cattle. They'd have to go in there to fill it. They'd have to go to your online fed cattle auctions, and they would have to go to those feedlots that are willing to sell cash cattle and negotiate on them rather than sit back and wait on a formula trade. So if your guys stuck to their guns and decided to negotiate and use their leverage, then you would have had higher prices. If the guys do like people do now, where they go to a new car place and they just figure they'll go to the one where the no haggle deal is, then they're probably not going to do that. But there's still guys that sit down and look at it as a challenge to see how cheap they can get that new pickup and how much they can get off the sticker price.
All right. So one of the questions submitted from Facebook says, what can we do to keep the big four packers from importing so much beef? when we have beef right here that is so much better quality? I think that's kind of an import-export question, and it's one that I get asked a lot from listeners and viewers. And I think it's something that we need to talk about as well. Scott, I'm going to start with you.
So thanks for switching us into the trade side of the equation. You know, I say we're certainly going to see folks who are looking for relative prices in terms of thinking about what we might bring in versus what we might export or what we might be producing domestically. There are times where we need product coming in from other countries, especially lean product that I think when you look at what we've traditionally brought in has been much of that product. Yes, we most of the time find ourselves in a net import position when we look at it from a quantity basis. We tend to be a net exporter when we look at it on a value basis, as we import traditionally lower valued products and export those higher valued products. I think as we see markets, hopefully supply side on the beef, begin to recover domestically, the interest in product coming from other countries will certainly move lower. You know, I've seen the Brazilians talk about wanting to move a bunch of beef into the United States. I think that might have been of more interest prior to some of their own COVID-19 issues they're beginning to see in some of those plants. And I would argue, all right, so to the question about fair trade, I always go, it's not export all you can and not import anything if we're going to play in that game. As I look forward, places like Japan, South Korea, China potentially, all become really important markets for us. And when you see what's been happening on the export side, the first period of this year, it's been relatively strong. We want to be careful about the message we send in terms of what we're willing to import into this country. I always say we need to make sure it meets whatever specifications we require. And I think USDA inspects that product as it's coming in. So again, we want to treat others as we want to be treated in the markets that we tend to export products.
Anybody else want to take a stab at that?
Sure. You know, this question has come up a lot. I've been answering it for 30 years, I guess. And there, you know, the place to start to understand this, first of all, is that beef is not one thing. This industry produces thousands of different products, and the market's job is to maximize the value of that entire set of products in terms of how it relates back then to the cattle that we produce that result in those products. And so that's a lot of things going on in lots of different markets. And in the US, because of our tremendous appetite for ground beef, hamburgers, about 31% of our total beef production winds up being as ground beef. It accounts for about 45% of our beef consumption on a per capita basis. And in order to make that ground beef, we take the trimmings from our fed steers and heifers, and we have to mix even more pounds of lean with that, because that fed trimmings is, call it 50, 55%. Maybe it averages more like 60% across the range of products that are produced. We have to mix additional lean with those to turn them into ground beef. We use our cull cow meat for that, cull cows and bulls, at least part of that meat. You know, we can grind other primal products, and we use imported lean to get enough of that. If we didn't want to import and instead wanted to rely just on cull cow meat, we would have to slaughter twice as many cows in this country as we do per year. So that's not really feasible. So when you look at the alternatives then, if we didn't import any beef, we would be left with several choices. One is we would just produce a lot less beef. 50% trimmings from fed cattle doesn't even meet the legal definition of ground beef. And so without additional lean, you can't market that product. So we would produce significantly less ground beef. We would basically make our industry smaller and less competitive in the fast food industry in particular. The other choice would be to grind up more chucks and rounds of the end primals of our products. We can do that now, and we do it on occasion when the prices are right. But the fact of the matter is those products have more value in other markets. And so we don't do that too much. The last choice would be, I guess we could take 10 to 15% of our steers and heifers and let them run out on rangeland like Australian range beef, and let them go to 2 or 3 years of age at mature levels and harvest them at cull cow prices and get some additional cull cow type lean that we could use to make up the rest of our ground beef. If you think about all three of those alternatives, they all lower the value in the beef industry. So the fact of the matter is we import product that helps us increase the value of our trimmings on our fed cattle, and we export other products that we could use in that process to a higher value. So we actually add value both ways. Imported beef is not the enemy of domestic beef at all. It's what allows us to be phenomenally competitive in the fast food industry that supports our tremendous hamburger habit. I guess the quickest way to avoid importing any beef would just be to get everybody to quit eating hamburger. That would take away that need for that product, and we wouldn't have to, we wouldn't be in the market then of trying to make as much ground beef as we do.
Corbett?
Was the question, how do we prevent them from bringing in so much beef, or what do we do about it?
What can we do to keep them from importing so much? Was kind of
we can't do anything to keep them from doing it. We're in a global economy. We trade things with people back and forth. And just like Daryl said, the reason that we do it is because of price and markets, and it's advantageous. And mostly your packers, it's so they can make some more money. They can import cheap grinding product, mix it with our excess fat trimmings that don't have a lot of value to them, and they can add value to it that way. And we like 99-cent junior cheeseburgers. So that's why we do it. How we prevent them from doing it, we really can't do that when we're in a global economy and we're trading things back and forth. And as soon as we stopped taking beef products from some country, then they would stop taking something else from us, and it would just start a trade war. And we really can't do that.
Yeah, I don't think
the only other thing I would add right quick is that, in fact, packers are not the ones importing a lot of the beef. The beef, for example, that goes into most of the fast food hamburger chains is done by third-party grinders. They buy the trimmings from the packers. They go out themselves and source this lean. To the extent that we bring in any muscle cuts, for the most part, that is done by other sectors of the food service industry primarily. So it's not the packers doing the majority of it. They probably do some, but it's other pieces of that food service sector that actually do most of that importing.
So let's talk. Scott, you alluded to this in your opening comments. We're starting to reopen the country. Oh, it's been a long day, huh? We're starting to reopen the country. And as we take a look at that, we're going to see more people venturing out. We're hoping to see some increased pull on the food service side, but that also means we're going to see more of everything. So what are some things that we're watching as it relates to the supply and demand situation here domestically?
I guess you let me go first again, right? So I'll start and all right. So we've all seen what's happened to box beef prices the last several days. I remind us we closed down 9:40 today in afternoon. So we may have seen the top for the short period of time. It seems to me that much of what's been at play has just been very short supplies, and how do we ration those short supplies here in the intermediate term, in the very near term, and that's driven us to much higher box beef prices. Now we get kind of this next phase of, hopefully, as we continue to process more cattle, we get more beef supplies onto the marketplace. We have that maybe pushing box beef prices lower, all else equal, at the same time as we see food service try to begin to pull. And we could have a little wave of pretty optimistic prices again if that food service pipeline pulls hard. For me, it's a little hard to know where that sits right now. If I look here locally, we have a lot of restaurants who are basically being told 25% capacity. We'll continue to relax that here in this state as we move forward. So that may be a slower fill or pull from that food service side than an immediate, let's just open the doors and let everyone come in. But that could be some positive pull, even with the increased beef supplies that I think will be, coming on the marketplace. As I think about that, then this is all going to be, how do consumers really behave? I've seen stories of places that consumers have been that it's all back to normal, right? Social distancing was yesterday's fad. This might all be about getting out again. And then in other cases, you have consumers who are very, I think, still worried about the COVID-19 effects, and many of them, I think, are taking this wait and see attitude. We're letting the country open a little bit. Let's see what happens. Let's see if we get a bunch more cases, and if we do, then I'm going to have stayed at home and avoided hopefully catching COVID-19. So I think that's at play. Consumer behavior, not so much from the economic side. The last piece of this for me is very much what's going to happen to the general economy. So we've got the third round of stimulus that is still helping. The beginnings of discussion with the House talking about a fourth phase that would add another $3 trillion in stimulus money out there. How does that help relative to the folks that are out of work? So I think it's one thing to say, I'm going to go out when restaurants open, I'm going to go out and have a good meal somewhere. But it's another to continue that if you don't have income coming in on the other side. And so I guess I push that out just a little bit further of that could be the drag again that starts to make things not quite so positive when we get a little bit further down the road. So to say we're over all of this and everything's headed back to normal, I think there's still a lot of phases left to unfold. And of course, none of us know exactly how COVID-19 cases will continue to unfold. I'm kind of, as I talk about this, saying it's the recovery that we all hope is going to continue to happen as we move forward. If we were to have another severe wave of COVID-19 in this country, all bets are off what it really means for us in a number of these sectors.
Do we also get concerned about grocery prices? And you mentioned the general economy. So does this potentially set us up for, I don't want to say a disaster, but a really scary domestic demand situation?
So it certainly could, and the stories of today are the ones right where food inflation's been the highest that we've seen in decades here the last month. And it's probably not surprising we're beginning to see some of that. And the stories of very expensive ground beef are out there. Corbett made mention of those, and we certainly see some of those cases. I sometimes have been looking at, so AMS provides us some weekly retail prices on a number of beef cuts just to try to see what's the grocery store side of this look like. If you take 90% or greater lean ground beef, they're reporting a $4.95 last week and a $5.57 this week. So they're certainly showing that increase. I'm curious to watch now as we move forward. Is there just a period of adjustment before we see the full pass through to the grocery store? But it's not a great combination of what is likely less money in consumers' pockets on top of spending more on beef. And by the way, I don't think that's shared equally among income groups in this country. I think those low income earners are the ones that are likely the ones that are suffering the most. And those are the ones that may be looking for the ground beef side of that equation. So I think by cuts of beef, we're going to see some differences in terms of how consumers behave as we come out of COVID-19.
A reminder for those of you that are watching, you can submit questions online through the Q&A button on the bottom. For those of you that are watching on Facebook Live, those questions are coming into us as well. One of the questions that we've had submitted, and Scott, we've talked about this, and this is not necessarily for Scott, but Scott and I have talked about this as it relates to the pork sector. But in order to get our market fundamentals working again sooner rather than later, which includes supply and demand fundamentals ultimately affecting prices, should we consider euthanization of our market-ready fed cattle and have the government offset those costs versus continued stimulus programs in the form of direct payments? Who wants to take that one?
Once again, I was muted. I forget to mute and then I forget to unmute. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think there's a number of issues out here. You know, there is a proposal out there now called a set-aside program for fed cattle to kind of pay to keep them in maintenance mode until such time as we can get caught up on the backlog. You know, there is the probably likelihood of additional round, at least one of additional stimulus type support. We don't know. That's a political question. And then, of course, in the hog industry, because of the nature of the production system, there's much less flexibility on those animals. So we are seeing euthanization of market-ready animals there simply because you're going to create much more problems back up the line if you do not do that. And we've seen a little bit on the poultry side as well. On cattle, we do have more flexibility. It's very expensive, and that's the situation we're in right now with the backlog. Euthanization, and of course, cattle are a lot bigger animal and they're a lot more valuable. So euthanization, I think, is really not what we're looking at. I think, you know, if you do the economics of even the cost of maintaining these animals, you'd have to maintain them a long time before it would make more sense to euthanize them. So I don't think we're faced with that. Now, it does mean that the industry producers at feedlot level and really all the way back up the chain to some extent are incurring a lot of costs to slow these cattle down and allow the processing sector to get caught up. So so I don't think euthanization is really the answer here. I mean, it's just a very costly way to go. The other thing that you know, when you think about something like this set-aside program versus maybe a direct payment kind of an option, you know, again, that's a policy choice. That's not really, you know, something that I want to say you should do this or that policy. But again, think through the consequences. Some of these things have the potential to be fairly market distorting and change the incentives of the players in the industry. One thing about direct payments, we may not be real comfortable with that in some cases, but they're just there. They don't really change the underlying incentives of what we're doing with the animals. And so I think those are the kinds of things that we should think through as we consider various policy alternatives that might be available to the industry.
Anybody else?
Megan, I think, you know, before we start euthanizing those cattle, we could just paint signs free on the front pen of those feedlots for those biggest cattle. And probably by the next morning, you wouldn't have a big issue. Now, you might have an issue with getting rid of some of the offal that's in the backyards of some of these people out there. But you got an animal that's worth $1,300, $1,400. You're not going to knock it in the head by any means. But I think we're going to be surprised. And Scott was talking earlier about how we're starting to get these packing plants at least a little bit online. Once we get past more of this fear of the COVID and we start getting these plants back up to speed, we'll be surprised how fast we can catch up. You know, last summer after the Holcomb fire, we lost a 6,500 head packing plant there. And when we started having larger slaughter per week than we'd been having before. So there's ways that we can step it up, start working all day on Saturday and things like that. And like I said before, the price is going to dictate that. And as long as it's advantageous to move those cattle faster through the system, then people will start doing it.
So that brings up one other question, another question that has been submitted online. So thoughts about slaughter capacity when we get into the new normal, that maybe with social distancing measures, temperature checks, spacing, those types of things. How do we have any idea what slaughter capacity looks like moving forward? And then how long does it take us to move through the backlog of animals? Scott, I'm going to start with you here.
Thanks, Megan. Sorry, you caught me have to come off of unmute as well. So, I was just looking again. USDA today said 91,000 head slaughtered. You got to go back to April 14th when we slaughtered a little more than 94,000 head. When I look at where I believe we pushed really hard, so a little bit of let's slaughter as many as we can. I think a lot of processors begin to see what was coming. We were sitting there at almost 120,000 head one day. So for me, it really sets how much more quickly can we recover. And I actually agree with Corbett. There's incentive to slaughter more cattle, given where box beef prices have been and slaughter cattle prices have been. And so I think we can get some recovery. So I'm not as worried about slaughter capacity, I guess, on the cattle side as I am on the hog side. Sometimes we get these spillover effects. We've got a problem in hogs, it seems to me, in that it'll be hard to get out of the backlog. I think even in the hog side, we found out it's hard to euthanize a bunch of market-ready hogs without some other factors we have to deal with, like how do you get rid of that product when it's all said and done. None of that's an easy process. But I feel like we have enough capacity for where we sit today in the cattle side. I do think we can catch up relatively quickly. We're going to have some heavy weights for a while. I think Daryl made mention of that. That's going to continue, I think, to plague us, and in fact could be one of the reasons why we get a lot of beef out there Q3 into Q4 this year that could be a little troubling on the price side. But I'm not worried about as much worried about slaughter capacity on the cattle side as I am on the hog side. We'll get work through these cattle unless, so to my point of, we don't know what's going to happen relative to COVID-19 a month or 2 months from now. And the scenario could play out that we could have another a massive increase in cases that shut us back down. That scenario is not really what we're talking about tonight. If it were to happen, thinking about set-asides for fed cattle and those things might make more sense than under that kind of bad COVID outcome than where I think most of us hope we're headed as we move forward.
Anybody else?
No, in general, I agree with that. I think it'll take us some time here as we move, towards the summertime to catch up on this backlog of cattle. There are incentives to do that as quickly as possible. I do think the post-COVID maximum or effective maximum capacity is probably a little bit less than before, although some of that will just be a matter of kind of getting used to the new processes and the retrofitting of fabrication lines and so on that goes on. The other thing that's kind of important to keep in mind, at least as a sort of a backstop to getting caught up, is the fact that we helped ourselves a lot in March with the cattle on feed situation. If you look at that March cattle on feed, we placed, 27% less or 22% less. So that sort of sets the stage that by about September at the latest, we're going to see some reduction in cattle coming through the feedlots. Probably April placements were down, not that much, but probably down as well. So if nothing else, we've got sort of that placement hole. I hate to use that term because they never turn out that way, but we probably do have a little bit of a hole coming up later in the year that would help us if we're not caught up already by that time. And so I think it's going to be a combination of what we do on the marketing side as we get our capacity back online, combined with the fact that the industry, again, they sort of anticipated what was happening. We marketed a lot of cattle in March as well, which took off some of the front end of the backlog. Certainly we do have a backlog, but it would have been even worse had we not marketed as aggressively as we did in March as well. So both of those things kind of help, and I think they do sort of emphasize Scott's point that we can recover from this thing. It may take several weeks going forward to get through all the backlog, but we can. I think we can get there relatively in a timely way.
I want to talk, and this specifically more for our ag economist. USDA supply and demand numbers came out yesterday and earlier this week, I should say, because we're taping on Wednesday evening and they came out on Tuesday. USDA suggesting a drop in production for Q3 and Q4, the third and fourth quarter of this year. Thoughts on those figures? Scott?
Sure, I'll start, and I'll let Daryl clean up the mess that I create for him. So big changes by USDA, I will say, in the May WASDE relative to where they were at in April. And again, I don't want to be critical of my USDA colleagues doing outlook in this period of time. It's a tough business. If you look at what USDA said about Q3 beef production, down 7.5%, relative to last year. Q4 down 3% relative to last year. Annually down 5%. They have made a fairly large annual adjustment. Just to put it in perspective, so second quarter they're suggesting down 17% in terms of production. I think some of the so I think Q2 is probably not a bad estimate on their part. I'm curious about this idea of the last question where we're trying to catch up. As we catch up, what's that do to third quarter production? I think you got to balance that relative to Daryl's comment about placements and the placement hole that comes, and that may be driving then both Q3 and Q4 to be lower in USDA's estimate. I actually go, if I believe that's true, I think we could get some really good price strength late in the year. That's a pretty healthy cut. If you look at per cap consumption on an annual basis of beef, USDA would say that's about, as I recall, 1.5 pounds or 2 pounds less. Now, again, if I now look at their 2021, which May WASDE is the first time they gave us 2021 estimates, they're back up 1.5 billion pounds or so in beef production. So they may be pushing a lot of this additional supplies into 2021. That kind of growth in beef production might make my price outlook a little less optimistic. So it's good to have these points to begin to talk about what happens the rest of the year. But it is certainly affecting many of us as we're putting those price estimates together.
Yeah, I think we're agreeing, Scott. I guess, and again, anybody can put together about any scenario that you see or want to right now. There's so much uncertainty in this thing. I have more adjustments within the year, which I think is kind of what Scott was saying, rather than at this point, I have not changed my estimate for overall 2020 beef production that much lower. I think obviously we're pushing a lot of Q2 into Q3 and probably some into Q4 even. And even the placement hole that I talked about is really more a matter of timing. Those animals are still out there somewhere and they are going to come to town. So I think a lot of what we've done is dramatically revise the timing of things between Q2, Q3, and Q4. And we may push some of it off into the beginning of next year. So, I may wind up revising my annual total down a little bit, but nothing as dramatic as what we've already got in place. And, at some point, this weight factor will offset some of that in the short run. So, again, I have not made those kind of changes in my annual total. It still looks to me like we're going to be at or very near a record level of total beef production in 2020. And so, all of these issues that we're dealing with right now in terms of the dramatic market reactions and these dramatic supply issues that we're dealing with are very short run issues for the most part that are affecting, now and for some period of weeks to come, but probably, by the end of the year, a lot of that from a production standpoint kind of works itself out. Now, I think Scott made the point earlier, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think the real unknown in this thing is sort of what's the macro economy look like? What's the recession impact look like from a demand standpoint as we go into the second half of the year? That's where the potential is, I think, for some real pressure in the market potentially. And I can see one scenario where by the fourth quarter, we've got some significant recovery in place and kind of back on track, if you will. But I can also see scenarios where it doesn't happen anywhere near that fast. And then we push some of this recessionary stuff off into at least the beginning of 2021. So I think that's, to me, the bigger unknown, although there's lots of unknowns about the timing, certainly for the next couple of quarters on this production side as well.
Gentlemen, I thank you so much for your time this evening. As we wrap up, one more question. It's a two-parter before we let you give your closing comments and we wrap up for this evening. What are some ways to keep packers accountable? And the second part of that is how do independent producers, or how are independent producers better able to protect their prices? Who would like to start there?
We talked about a way to keep your packers more honest, which is mandate negotiated minimum cash. If they've got to buy a certain amount of cattle on the cash market, they're going to go out there and look for them. And once guys figure that out, that they're going to come to their lot, they're going to bid on those cattle. And if the guy doesn't take the bid, they might come back again that week, instead of forget about him and then retaliate against him the next 2 weeks because he didn't take the bid that they gave him. So I think that's the only way we can do it. I mean, you can't fault them for trying to buy their product that they need as cheap as they can possibly buy it. I don't know anybody that wants to go out there and pay more than they do. But what was the second part of that question, Megan?
What's the best way for independent producers to protect their prices?
They've got to protect themselves. And if you're feeding cattle, and even if you're a farmer feeder, and even if you're just retaining ownership on your own calf crop or something, if you're not hedging, you're crazy. You've got to. Everybody else is doing it, and you're out of step with everybody else. And I guarantee you, these guys that don't hedge. And, it used to be a kind of a challenge, and some of your big shots would do it. I've got to hit a home run once in a while. I can't break even every time. I can't hedge. I'm not going to hedge all these. Even those guys are hedging, I promise you. Find you a broker that has some different ideas. And you don't have to just take a straight up short position for the amount of cattle that you have on feed. There's a lot of risk management schemes that still give you some upside potential and limit your downside risk, but not just a complete offset of that. But and then there's spreads you can do throughout the feeding period there to try to help you out. But you've got to protect your risk if you're going to go into feeding cattle, because once you lock the gate on those cattle in a feedlot, your options are over. You're going to continue to feed those cattle until they're done. And then you're going to take the market that you can get. And hopefully, if we can get some mandated minimum cash, maybe we'll have some leverage on that end rather than just having to lay down and take whatever they give you.
Daryl or Scott?
Well, specifically with regards to the risk question, Corbett's right there. There's a host of futures-based risk management tools that are out there. There's other things, forward contracting as a way to protect risk, although we're talking about making that not something that we can do. So, it depends on what works under different market circumstances. But I think to Corbett's point very strongly, most of that opportunity to manage risk and to set yourself up for a margin happens before you place cattle. And he's absolutely right. Once you get in it, you don't have much leverage, and that's the nature of the business. So it comes about setting it up, at the beginning, however you're going to do that in terms of, it ranges all the way from whether I should place cattle, what kind of cattle I'm placing, and all of that, all the way through all of the overt sort of risk management tools that we're talking about, that range of things that can help you know when you go in what kind of a margin you may be able to protect on those cattle.
Scott, any
I'll keep it simple. I always tell producers not doing any risk management is a risk management strategy. It may not be a very good one. And so they should understand, as many of them I think sometimes don't do much risk management, that is in fact a default strategy that may not serve them well long term.
All right. We weren't able to get through all of our questions submitted online, and I apologize for that. Before we let everybody go this evening, we'll start with Daryl for some closing comments.
You bet. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to do this. Thanks to Brownfield for hosting this. Obviously we have been in and are still in an absolutely unprecedented situation in the entire economy and indeed in the whole world. And so the cattle industry and the beef industry is caught up in this. We're dealing with lots of things we've never seen before, lots of forces at play here that are trying to work through all of the challenges that we face. I think, and we've seen very different stages. I think the March discussion was very different than the April and early May discussion. And we're probably going to move on, as Scott said earlier, into several more phases as we go through this. So there's going to be more things to think about as we go through this. I do think in terms of this current phase relative to the interruption we've had in processing cattle and so on, it looks like that we are kind of turning the corner. We can begin to think about the backside of that in terms of recovering from that, and then move on to, kind of thinking ahead to the second half of the year on both the demand and the supply side, and see just where we stand with respect to, the kind of recovery that we could see, as well as the risks that are out there that range from a second wave of COVID to, lots of issues in global trade and overall market opportunities that exist for the industry.
Corbett, final thoughts?
Yeah, even though I think I know we're starting to come out of this COVID, and God help us if we have another big backlash, because it'll be an absolute catastrophe, not just for agriculture, but for the entire country. But I think things are going to get tougher as we move forward on this. We looked up today and we saw the first day in a long time that our choice boxes were quite a bit lower, and they weren't even $10 lower, where they've been gaining $20 to $30 every day for weeks and weeks. But it wasn't even $10 lower, and that was still a record drop for one day. So that gives you an idea of how normally your box beef cutout values are pretty steady. They don't do these big, wide, crazy swings like we've seen on this deal. But I think we're going to look up one of these days, and our choice boxes are going to be down 20 or 30 or 40. And when it does, your packers are going to see that $2,600 profit that they're making on these cattle start to go away big time. And they're going to want to back up these cattle a little bit. And I think we have to look at the results or any benefits we get from the DOJ investigations, which are ongoing. Even President Trump has said that he wants to see those investigations go forward, and they are. And you can promise yourself that's the only reason we have $1.15 cattle today. fats is because of those investigations. They would be somewhere below 95 if we didn't have those, because we see the packers that are wanting to save face and hold their reputation coming out and giving those prices. When you look at the board and you look at the big supplies and the lack of demand, there would be no reason for them to give that price other than these investigations starting to breathe down their neck a little bit. And there's some government intervention, and I think most people are liking that pretty good, that government intervention. But I'm more worried about your cattle producers, your cow-calf people, and your backgrounders than I am the feeders. Like I said, most of your feeders are hedged up. Yeah, they're going to get some big cattle on them. I don't think most of these packers have the gall to penalize them for those heavy carcasses that much, and so far they're not doing it. So we're going to be able to work through that. But as we go forward in this deal, these cow-calf producers and these backgrounders have to realize how vulnerable that they are, and that's where all the market loss has been, is on your calves and yearlings. And we're going to lose the rest of our independent cattle feeders. We've got 4 packers. We're going to have if this deal doesn't change, we're going to have 8 to 12 of their big corporate feeding partners feeding all the cattle, and then we're just going to keep losing it as we go closer to the grassroots of the deal. But we can't forget something that a friend of mine told me a long time ago. As long as we buy feeder cattle in a competitive market and sell fat cattle in a non-competitive market, this deal is no good for feeding cattle. And that's what I'm afraid of. And we're closer to that now than we would have been if we hadn't had the COVID.
Thanks, Corbett. Scott?
So Megan, thanks, and thanks to Brownfield for doing this. It's always good to catch up with you as we do our weekly livestock update. I guess as I close, I just want to focus on what other things am I watching as we move forward that I think are going to be important. And I'll start out of the gate in the very short term. It's all going to be about slaughter numbers on a daily, weekly basis, and how much more those grow. I hope they continue to grow in terms of slaughter numbers, and I think that's positive for us in terms of what it could mean for cattle prices. I guess as I look longer term, I think then the kind of next step of that is the consumer side, and a combination of what's higher prices mean with what's going to be lower income in the pockets of many of those folks. I think that's kind of that next phase. I guess from a positive standpoint, it is just how short the beef supplies get here in the short term as we push cattle out, coupled with what I think is going to be strong export demand. You and I talk about this almost every week because we need something positive to talk about, and I think exports is certainly one of the areas where we're going to continue to see some growth in U.S. beef product, out of the United States. I often say I am sure glad we're feeding $3 corn today, and we tend to be in a better feed situation. I would hate to think about what this industry would look like if we were facing the feed costs of 5 or 6 years ago. It would certainly be just another added blow. And I guess as I close, I hope folks will begin to think about what makes me do some price risk management. What level of cattle prices makes me say, now's that I'm good. I like where they're at. I want to get rid of the risk, because I think all of us tonight have talked about there's a lot of risk between now and the end of the year. In some ways that could lead to higher prices. In some ways, I think it could lead to lower prices. When are you ready to let someone else have that risk? I hope folks will think very hard about that in their own operation. And I say that hoping that we keep these operations moving forward as we go. And the last piece I'll add is, let's not forget, payments ought to be coming soon. That third round of stimulus money, that there are payments that are destined for the cattle industry. I look for USDA very soon to give us a lot more information about how those payments are going to reach cattle producers. They're much needed given just how tough it's been the last few weeks. So I look forward to seeing the details of that information as well.
Scott, thank you so much. Daryl, Corbett, thank you as well for joining us for another round of these conversations. We hope that this evening has been informative. I know we didn't get to some questions. If you have them, if you want to send me an email, we'll get you an answer. My work email is mgrebner@brownfieldnetwork.com. As Scott mentioned, we host a weekly program on Fridays afternoon, the weekly livestock market update. If you visit our website, brownfieldagnews.com, you can subscribe to the newsletter that comes out Saturday morning with notes and market analysis from the week. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, for those of you here on the Zoom and those of you joining us on Facebook Live as well. Have a great evening. I'm Megan Grebner for Brownfield.